respect, man. He be on point 100% of the times when it comes to the foolishness about the division within Africans in the diaspora. I want to introduce y'all to the brother. His name is Shakara, and he's going to do a presentation showing Pan-Africanism in a 2023 sense and looking at it for as far as the future going forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Shakara. Peace, my brother. How you doing?
I'm good. First of all, Tendai Mwadi, giving thanks unto the Mother, Father, Creative Life Force of the universe. Kuzai, Mudzima Mokolo, giving praises unto our great ancestors. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodie, African liberation and African power for all African people. I'm giving thanks to Brother Garfield for the invitation. He asked me to deliver on basically the history of Pan-Africanism. Yeah, so I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to bring it up to date in terms of the Pan-African philosophy and thought and mission, yeah, of today, yeah. And so I hope ones get something from it. For those who are not aware of me, I am a born and raised Black nationalist Pan-Africanist and also African spiritualist. Born and raised in the UK, I'm a member of the Al-Qibla Revivalist movement. I'm also a member of the UNIA ACL RC 2020, which is the organization founded by the most honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, and I'm also a member of the Black Star Action Network International, yeah? And so do check out those organizations right there. So, and I'm now going to share my screen and get into the presentation. All right, family. So let me share up the full screen vibration. Okay. So, as you can see, I've entitled the presentation, Black Nationalism, Pan-Africanism, a chronicle of revolutionary thought and action. And so, no, it's a chronicle, it's not the chronicle. There's plenty that will not be in the presentation because we're dealing with a history in its formal sense that spans at least back until the year 1900s and really and truly well before then, yeah? But I'm a start really in the 1800s and go forward. And then bearing in mind, in dealing with the history, because I understand that it is Black History Month as it is celebrated and observed in the United States of America, as well as the rest of the world, yeah? For those who are not aware, the UK is the only country in which Black History Month is celebrated in a month other than February, okay? And another day we'll go into the reasons behind that. But I want to acknowledge Baba Carter G. Woodson for his foresight in inspiring and initiating this observance of Black History Month, okay? But I'm guided by the wisdom of ones like Baba John Henrik Clark. And so when we teach history, when we go into history, we are engaging in political education at the same time. And so when we say a chronicle of revolutionary thought and action, we're not just probing the events, we're looking at the ideas, yes, the ideation of our ancestors and our elders and what they were fighting for and how they fought, yeah, and how that can inspire us and inform our action and our mission and our goal setting in this day and age. And I hope that makes sense. So I want to acknowledge the context of the conversation first and foremost, yeah? And the reason why this is important to do is because over the past few years, there has been a significant backlash against the concept of Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, all right? A significant backlash against the concept of Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and the movement that is inspired by the ideals of Black nationalist Pan-Africanism. I am, what is that, not now? Nenen? Yeah. I am a Black nationalist Pan-Africanist, yeah? I'm a Garveyite in that respect. And so when we see backlash against the Pan-African movement, we have to understand where it comes from and why it exists. And it seems to me that a significant amount of that backlash has infiltrated and pierced through the so-called conscious community or the so-called online conscious community, yeah? And so I'm acknowledging the context for this conversation, right, you know? And, you know what I mean? No doubt that there'll be much more conversation after this. No doubt that there will be people doubling down on statements that they've made over the past few years and the past few months. And no doubt that there'll be also people walking back and going like, so they never said what they did say. You know what I'm saying? Yesterday and today and tomorrow and all of these things. But I say it, God, it's all good and it's all part of the process. And so we look forward to further engagement yeah, with the subject matter, especially on platforms such as these. And I appreciate Brother Garfield for, availing the platform for a presentation such as this. So give thanks to Brother Garfield, manners and respect. All right, so we're going to begin with some definitions here. And this particular beginning is taken from the book Pan-Afrikanism, A History by Brother Hakim Adi, a historian that I had the pleasure of really knowing, growing up, seeing, because he lives in the UK growing up. And so this book is a very good overview, yes, of Pan-Africanism through the ages. And so he says, in fact, there has never been one universally accepted definition of exactly what constitutes Pan-Africanism. Some writers on the subject are even reluctant to provide a definition or suggest that one cannot be found, acknowledging that the vagueness of the term reflects the fact that Pan-Africanism has taken different forms at different historical moments and geographical locations. Nevertheless, most writers would agree that the phenomenon has emerged in the modern period and is concerned with the social, economic, cultural, and political emancipation of African peoples, including those of the African diaspora. What underlies the manifold visions and approaches of Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanists is a belief in the unity, common history, and common purpose of people of Africa and the African diaspora, and notion that their destinies are interconnected. In addition, many would highlight the importance of the liberation and advancement of the African continent itself, not just for its inhabitants, but also as the homeland of the entire African diaspora. Such perspectives might be traced back to ancient times, but Pan-Africanist thought and action is principally connected with and provoked by the modern dispersal of Africans resulting from the trafficking of captives across the Atlantic to the Americas, as well as elsewhere from the end of the 15th century to the close of the 19th century. This slave trade, the largest forced migration in history, and the creation of the African diaspora was accompanied by the emergence of global capitalism, European colonial rule, and anti-African racism. Yeah. So just note the general themes. Yeah. Now, people like to make a lot about the fact that there's not one definition of Pan-Africanism. Like any school of thought, like any social theory and idealism, there are variations within it, but there are certain generic themes that can be found, yeah, and can justifiably be identified within Pan-Africanism. And so we're going to explore some of the different shades of Pan-Africanism as we go through the presentation. But we're going to get a bit of a definition here as well. So I'm going to give you some specific definition, yeah? One of the things that we are taught by Baba Kwame Ture is that, technically speaking, Pan-Africanism in and of itself is not an ideology. Pan-Africanism is a goal, and your specific ideology identifies a specific roadmap that you use to achieve that goal. So the goal would be the unification and liberation of Africa and all African people. And then the All African People's Revolutionary Party would add under scientific socialism, yeah? Scientific socialism is the ideology that is guiding the actions and the ideation of the All African People's Revolutionary Party towards achieving the goal of Pan-Africanism. And they will define themselves as Nkrumah Isturius, coming in the line of the legacy of the Asante Kwame Nkrumah and Secretariat. Now, from a Black nationalist point of view, we are critical of socialism I should say, from a Black nationalist and an African-centered point of view. We are critical of socialism, not just in and of itself, but because it's within the context of its application to African people. Do we adopt social, political, and economic theory from other groups of people and just apply it to ourselves? Yeah. And so from a Black nationalist or African point of view, it's not that we can't learn from socialism, Marxism, so on and so forth. However, we do not adopt the theory wholesale in application to the African liberation fight. And so we drawing from the definition provided by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, would say Pan-Africanism is total liberation or unification of African and African people under a Ma'at/Ubuntu world system. And Ma'at Ubuntu reflects African-centered ideals of social organization, political development, and economic development, if that makes sense. And the idea is that we invest and draw out the best of our culture, update it and apply it to the now in order to solve our problems today. Okay, so it's a task. That Ma'at Ubuntu doesn't mean that we have things in the past that we can just pick up wholesale and supply as it was 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, but that we have principles and values to learn from in terms of how African society develops, yes, that we can use to learn how we need to evolve for the future. I hope that makes sense. And so for a broad, non-necessarily ideological definition of Pan-Africanism, we can draw on the wisdom of brother Kofi Klue, who is a Pan-Africanist from Ghana, but also based in the UK. And he says Pan-Africanism is an anti-imperialist decolonizational movement rallying together a broad array of all African-loving forces that are interested in networking, globally and locally. And I want to emphasize globally and locally. So we're organizing locally, but with a global purview. And we're also linking globally and connecting the global to our local. Okay? Very important point, which I will emphasize a little bit later on. In pursuit of various configurations of an independent, worldwide, political, ideological, cultural, organizational framework of struggle for the total liberation, unification, and self-determined progression of Africans and our kith and kin. Yeah? So that's giving you some broad definitions. On another day, we will delve in the definition, then going like deep, yeah, and extract every principle that is necessary. Yeah? This is a historical overview, however. So let's move forward with the understanding that most people will grasp, yeah, the very basic ideas that have been expressed thus far. I'm going to skip these deeper explorations for today's presentation, but do check out a very interesting paper written by an auntie by the name of Omotayo Oloruntoba Oju. Yeah, it's entitled Pan-Africanism, Myth and History in African and Caribbean Drama. She begins by giving a relatively good overview of Pan-Africanism in ideation and practice, all right? And so one of the primary factors within Pan-Africanism, yes, is this idea of identity, yes, identity and how it relates to our political goals. And for obvious reasons, it should be obvious that the principal identity that we affirm from a Pan-African perspective and a Black nationalist perspective and an African fundamentalist perspective, or a universal African nationalist perspective, the latter two being terms that are used to refer to Garveyism, is the identity of Africa, okay? And the reason for this should be obvious, but to explain, we're gonna go to one of the forerunners of Pan-Africanism, or should I say the forerunners of the coining of the term Pan-Africanism. He's considered one of the forefathers of Pan-Africanism and the forefathers of, or the founding fathers of Black nationalism or African nationalism. He goes by the name of Martin Delany, okay? And in writing in the 1800s, the mid 1800s, he says, let it then be understood as a great principle of political economy that no people can be free who themselves do not constitute an essential part of the ruling element of the country in which they live, whether this element be founded upon a true or false, a just or an unjust basis. This position in community is necessary to personal safety. The liberty of no man is secure who controls not his own political destiny. What is true of an individual is true of a family. And that which is true of a family is also true concerning a whole people. By the way, for the reference, Martin Delany, Political Destiny of the Colored Race on the American Continent, again, right in 1854. To suppose otherwise is that delusion which at once induces its victim through a period of long suffering patiently to submit to every species of wrong, trusting against probability and hoping against all reasonable grounds of expectation for the granting of privileges and enjoyment of rights which never will be attained. This delusion reveals the true secret of the power which holds in peaceable subjection all the oppressed in every part of the world. I'm not even going to explain that because it should speak for itself. We're going to move forward. A people to be free must necessarily be their own rulers. That is, each individual must in himself embody the essential ingredient, so to speak, of the sovereign principle which composes the true basis of his liberty. This principle, when not exercised by himself, may at his pleasure be delegated to another, his true representative. Then, to be successful, our attention must be turned in the direction of towards those places where the Black and colored man comprise by population and constitute by necessity of numbers the ruling element of the body politic, and where, when occasion shall require it, the issue can be made and maintained on this basis. Where our political enclosure and national edifice can be reared, established, walled, and proudly defended on this great elementary principle of original identity. Yes? This again should speak for itself, but just to explain, what he's affirming here is the basis for nation building. And specifically, the basis for nation building for a people coming as we have, as African people, out of a system of oppression that had denigrated our very beingness as African people, destroying our indigenous institutions of self-governance, economics, politics, law, labor, spirituality, etc., etc., etc. Yes? And so within that context, yes, one of the greatest defenses that we have against such an onslaught is to organize together in ways whereby we represent the majority, the overwhelming majority of the body politic that represents who we are and our interests as a people. And what he uses to refer to this is the concept of original identity. And that original identity for African people is African, speaking in the collective sense of the terminology. All right? So, upon this solid foundation rests the fabric of every substantial political structure in the world, which cannot exist without it. And so soon as a people or a nation lose their original identity, just so soon must that nation or people become extinct. Powerful though they may have been, they must fall, because the nucleus which heretofore held them together, becoming extinct, there being no longer a center of attraction or a basis for a union of the parts, a dissolution must naturally ensue as the result of the neutrality of the basis of the adhesion among the particles of matter. And so we see here that for the forefathers of African nationalism, the forefathers of Pan-Afrikanism, the African identity was designed as a center of attraction, a basis for a union of parts among African people to provide a nucleus for the organization of African people. It doesn't mean that all African people have to be one exact and the same. Yes, that's not the point here. The point is having a gravitational pull and center of attraction through which, and that allows us, yes, to develop a basis for our political, economic, and social organizing. And so this is exemplified in the number of early organizations that we had throughout the Americas, specifically throughout the Americas, and not just the United States of America, but also the Caribbean, South and Central America, that carried the identifier African for identifying us as a people. Not going to go through all of this, but you can read it in your own time, should the spirit move you. And so the person, yeah, So give me 1 second right now.
Yes, family, soaking that great information by our brother, man. He's dropping some serious information. Pay attention and get your notes and get everything going. And let me tell you something, this is some deep stuff. We need this in the community. What he's saying right now, we need this information. All right, Sylvester Williams, that's where he's at. Henry Sylvester Williams. I think he was one of the first guys who talked about Pan-Africanism with the conference. Well, go ahead, beloved.
All right, give thanks. Yes, I. So, well, the person who's credited, the person who's credited with coining and popularizing the term Pan-Africanism is Henry Sylvester Williams, and he created the African Association, which became known as the Pan-African Association in the late 1800s, okay? And so, as it says here, drawing from Pan-Africanism and history, the Pan-African Association was mainly concerned with various injustices in Britain, in Britain's African colonies, as well as the Caribbean. It aimed to present accurate information to influence British public opinion so that members of the parliament could be instructed that the better treatment of the native races should command greater attention in parliament. It declared that it wished to encourage unity amongst Africans and be a representative body on matters affecting the destiny of the African race. Yeah, so these are very basic goals, ideals, you know what I'm saying? They're trying to appeal to the sensibilities of the British Parliament, yeah? Now, it would be true to say that the Baba Delaney aspect, of things, even the Baba Edward Wilmot Blyden aspect of things prior to Henry Sylvester Williams was far more radical, far more revolutionary in its trajectory, all right? And we're gonna come back to how that develops shortly, okay? But these different sensibilities do exist. Hakim Adi goes on, this is a very important point. Although membership was only open to Black men, its joint founder was an African woman, Anne Victoria Kinloch from South Africa. Okay, so one of the misconceptions about Pan-Africanism in its early development is that it didn't involve Africans on or from the continent. Yeah, this is false. Okay, one of the Africans on the continent around this time is a man by the name of J.E. Casey Hayford, and there are others who we'll get to shortly. But this particular sister, Anne Victoria Kinloch, was an African from South Africa who buck up on Henry Sylvester Williams in Britain, and she's a co-founder of the African Association. Okay, she came to Britain in 1896 and had been lecturing and writing on the oppression of Africans in her homeland throughout the country. Little is known of Kinloch's motives for traveling to Britain, but her important role was made clear by Williams, who wrote that the association is the result of Mrs. Kinloch's work in England and the feeling that as British subjects, we ought to be heard in our own affairs. Kinloch herself explained that with some men of my race in this country, I have formed a society for the benefit of our people in Africa. Yeah, and so basically the people that are concerned with taxation without no representation. Yeah, and we say, George Washington and them people there, they fought a whole war over this one issue. Okay. Taxation without representation. Well, that go on when it comes to Africans being colonized by Britain and all of them. And so Africans are beginning to campaign, for greater say in the affairs of our homeland and our nation. But it seems after Williams met with the Haitian writer and Pan-Africanist Benito Sylvian in Paris, the scope of the conference was broadened to include treatments of the native races under European and American rule. Consequently, lynching in the United States would be discussed. One important aim of the conference was to demonstrate that those of African descent could speak for themselves against all the injustices they faced, and contemporary reports stress that this was the first occasion on which Africans had united for the attainment of equality and freedom. Williams also insisted that women deserve a prominent position at the conference. Haiti in the 1800s, more research needs to be done in terms of the contribution of Haiti to Pan-Africanism. One, on the basis of the inspiration of the Haiti Revolution. If you, anybody read or study the work of anybody who was campaigning or fighting in any way, shape, or form on behalf of African people from in the 1800s through to the early 1900s, you will find the theme of Haiti very strongly, yes? And the inspiration of Haiti very strongly. But also, there were many Haitians, people from Haiti who traveled, yes, and organized with brothers and sisters from around the African diaspora. And Benito Sylvian is one such individual, yeah? And we can see that we're seeing a radicalization and a broadening of the scope now of what the brothers and sisters are fighting for. And this emphasizes a primary principle of Pan-Africanism, yeah, which is that we must be in tune with the everyday experiences of our brothers and sisters around the world. Not all of our particularities are going to be exactly the same. Yes. So one of the aims of Pan-Africanism is to inform ourselves about what Africans are facing in the United States of America, what Africans are facing in Haiti, what Africans are facing in the Congo and South Africa, what Africans are facing in Jamaica and Dominica, what Africans are facing in Brazil and Cuba, and so on and so forth, and allow that to inform our connection and our networking and our international global development as a people. Yeah. The Pan-African Conference, the first Pan-African Conference, was held in the year 1900s, and it was held at Westminster Town Hall, not far from the British Parliament, from the 22nd to the 24th of July 1900. The discussion focused on slavery, colonialism, racism, all forms of oppression against Africa and Africans, and how they might be removed. In addition, there was also a focus on possible forms of reparations for Africa and Africans. The conference was chaired by Bishop Alexander Waters and included speakers from the United States, the Caribbean, and Africa, in addition to those based in Britain. I'm emphasizing the fact that at the very first conference that was labeled Pan-African, yeah, ignoring for a second the proto-Black nationalist Pan-Africanist endeavors that existed prior to 1900. The very first conference that carried the name Pan-African had a focus on reparations for African people. I'm just pointing that out and emphasizing. So the primary issue at this point in time is the scramble for Africa. Yeah, the scramble for Africa, which is really a period. Yeah, them said Britain abolished the so-called slave trade in 1807. Right around that same period of time, Britain is starting wars with the Zulu. Britain is starting wars with the Ashanti and the Fanti. Britain is starting wars all over the place, soon to be joined by France and Germany and Belgium on the African continent. Every now and then, the European, them, the white man, them buck up them one another and then go to war with them one another over whatever land they are trying to annex, yeah, at a particular point in time, okay? And so Belgium and Germany are new kids on the block as far as being nation states, yeah? Very, very new kids on the block as far as being nation states in Europe, yeah? But as soon as they consolidate themselves as a nation, one of the first things they want to do is annex some land, yeah, in Africa and colonize up the place. And so they call on their European brothers and sisters, yeah, to assist them in this endeavor so that they can all stop warring with each other, yes, when they buck up them one another, and collaborate, yes, in their colonial intentions. And so the Berlin Conference, AKA the Congo Conference, was at the heart of the scramble for Africa, the invasion, occupation, colonization, and annexation of African territory by European powers during the period of new imperialism. Yeah, from 1881 to 1914 is the kind of the era where they really intensified this particular fight, yeah? And 1914, the process was completed. That year is the year that what we now know today as Nigeria was created. Important for us to note that the General Act, however, of the Berlin Conference was signed by more than the nations who were actively colonizing the continent. So including at this conference, present at this conference, were representatives from Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire, Portugal, Russia, Sweden, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. I want people to understand that this was most definitely a pan-European endeavor in which they were gathering to assist each other in their criminal activity of colonization of the African continent after a number of centuries of enslaving African people. So just to give you two examples of what happened here, yeah, and this is just two examples, yeah, because bearing in mind that the map, a lot of what we see as countries on the African continent today, the majority of those borders were drawn at this conference, yeah? All but maybe two of those borders were drawn at this particular conference, okay? And so as far as Nigeria is concerned, Britain purchased, yes, Nigeria, what is now today Nigeria, from the Royal Niger Company. The Royal Niger Company still exists to this day, yes? And it's called Unilever, yes? And it was published for £865,000, which is today 108 million, yeah, pounds, okay? So I'm emphasizing here that this was a collaboration between the state, the British state, and British-based private corporations on the other hand, yeah? Throughout enslavement and colonialism, you will see collaborations between states, governments, and private corporations acting on behalf of the nation as a whole, or at the very least, the elites of the nation as a whole. Thus, Nigeria was created to fulfill a business requirement, i.e. supplying goods and services for the UK, yeah? And so we're seeing here that the purpose of colonization was to rape the nations that were being colonized, the peoples that were being colonized, of their land, their labor, and their resources for the benefit of the colonizing nation, okay? And then you have Congo, yeah? Same concept, process, but a different particular tool was used. Congo was effectively gifted, yeah, to King Leopold. All those nations that I mentioned before, Belgium, them just come as a nation, them want somewhere to go, and so them give Congo, not to Belgium, the nation, but to King Leopold. It was King Leopold's private property, yes? And so Belgian rubber extraction was heavily funded, yes, by British and US banks and corporations. Again, this is a pan-European agenda. The machinations of King Leopold in Congo murdered estimates between 15 to 20 million people, yes? And this effectively halved the population of the Congo within the space of about a decade, yeah? The population of the Congo was halved, yes, by the mercenaries in the Congo under the control of King Leopold II of Belgium, yeah? So these are some of the horrors that were faced by our ancestors on the continent, okay? So, coming from Henry Sylvester Williams, one of the individuals that was present at the 1900 conference was a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois. Henry Sylvester Williams passes away in 1912, yeah, thereabouts. And the terminology Pan-Afrikanism is not as well used, it's not as popular for a period of time. The person who is responsible for repopularizing it to some degree is W.E.B. Du Bois. And he hosts a number of Pan-African conferences between 1919 and 1927. Yeah, there are more Pan-African congresses. Now, no, the first one was a Pan-African conference. These are Pan-African congresses. Okay, the difference is important. All right, he has a number of Pan-African congresses. There are more Pan-African congresses, but these are the ones that were under W.E.B. Du Bois' leadership. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right. And so the resolutions for the first Pan-African Congress read as follows: that the Allied and associated powers establish a code of law for the international protection of the natives of Africa, similar to the proposed international code for labor. That the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, establish a permanent bureau charged with the special duty of overseeing the application of these laws to the political, social, economic welfare of the natives. The Negroes of the world demand that hereafter the natives of Africa and peoples of African descent be governed by the following principles. And the principles relate to fair labor laws, land laws, everybody being equal before the law, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So again, these are relatively moderate, proposals, relatively moderate demands. Okay, we just want greater representation to be treated fairly under colonial rule. Yeah, a lot of the brothers and sisters that were present at these Pan-African congresses were very colonially minded, in the sense of the fact that, for example, some of them would laud the virtues of French colonialism, while at the same time condemning racism in America, but putting forward a French example as a preferable one, a more enlightened one than what was going on in America at the time. Okay, and so a lot of them were very tied up in the British and the French sensibility. All right, in that regard. Another thing that was taking place that was not unconnected to the Pan-African Congresses was the National Congress of British West Africa. And this was a group of Africans on the continent itself, that were talking about turning West Africa into a single nation with a single nationality, okay? And this is one of the leading lights of that particular endeavor. He goes by the name of J.E. Casely Hayford, and he's connected to a lot of different things happening in the African world at that time, some more radical than this particular formation, but it's just necessary to note. And if you want to come back and read what's on the screen, you can do so. I do, however, want to emphasize, that within the context of the National Congress of British West Africa, the NCBWA revived the notion of a West African nationality, the view that all peoples in West Africa, especially the 4 British colonies, were interrelated and had a common destiny, okay? So this is happening on the African continent. Now, there are those brothers and sisters who want to promote the fallacy that Africans on the continent are only capable, of identifying and socially, politically, and economically organizing on the basis of so-called tribe. Another day, we're going to go into the extent to which this concept is a colonial one. We don't have time to deal with that today, okay? But based upon the ancient and modern history of Africans in West Africa, the limitation or attempting to limit West African political economic organization and social organization to the idea of tribe is an idea that has been proliferated by British colonizers in particular and Western colonizers in general. And next day we're going at them something there and let's mash that up very nicely. Okay? However, the movement that can be and often is rightfully so credited with giving Pan-Africanism, one, its mass organizational character, and two, its radical ideation is that of the Garvey movement. The movement led by the most honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And whereas W.E.B. Du Bois hosted Pan-African Congresses, the UNIA-ACL, which was the organization founded by the most honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, hosted international conventions of the Negro peoples of the world. It would also be true to say, and I'm not saying this because I'm a Garveyite, but the numbers and the history bears this to be the case, that the international conventions were actually far more representative of the African world. One, because of the numbers that attended the international conventions. For example, at the first one in 1920, there was over 25,000 people who attended. And also, they tended to have a far greater representation of the African world from various different parts of the Americas, from various different parts of the continent, either present at the convention itself or represented through emissaries or correspondences, to the convention. And so these conventions took place. Again, there are more conventions after Papa Garvey himself, but I'm focusing on the ones that took place under his leadership directly. These conventions took place from between 1920 and 1938 as far as the life of Papa Garvey is concerned. One of the things that I want to point out, however, is that in the sixth international convention in 1929, which was in Kingston, Jamaica, was bigger than some of those that took place in the USA. I'm emphasizing this point because there is a fallacy out there that after Marcus Mosiah Garvey leaves America, not a Naguan for the UNIA-ACL again, not a Naguan for Marcus Garvey. Well, there's at least, 12,000 people at the 1929 convention in Jamaica, and about 100,000 people march in the parade, through the streets, all right, in Jamaica in 1929 with the UNIA-ACL, okay? Very important to note. There's more that we could say about that in terms of, let's go forward. So bear in mind that the UNIA-ACL, the difference between it and a lot of other people who were around at this time was that whereas the UNIA-ACL was talking about independence, no, colonizer for ghetto, no, as I've shown, a lot of other platforms were more moderate, just great representation, okay? Whereas the UNIA-ACL was saying, no, autonomy, sovereignty, self-government, no. That we want, that we are looking for, white boy, come out of our land, we know why you did that, and all these things, okay? So because of that, it required the UNIA-ACL to focus more on institution building, And we see here, the UNIA-ACL had 11 million members worldwide, over, that's at its peak, and that's an estimate, over 1,000 branches in over 40 countries, built 2 shipping companies, which are the Black Star Line and the Black Cross Training and Navigation Company, had a nursing agency, which is the Black Cross Nurses, paramilitary defense and security units, most notably the Universal African Legion and the Universal African Motor Corps, the latter being the military trained women of the organization, wholesale, retail, manufacturing businesses, most notably the Negro Factories Corporation, schools and universities, newspapers and magazines, propaganda, political parties and unions, I'm gonna come back to that one in a second, international industrial development programs, and so on, okay? So at the first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world, as I've said, 25,000 people turn up. Marcus Mosiah Garvey is elected as the provisional president of the United States of Africa as part of a government in exile. Now, there is a fallacy out there that says that Marcus Garvey elected himself president. It is false. He was elected as a part of a provisional government. If you study revolutionary histories beyond African peoples, you will understand and know that provisional governments are not strange. If you are in a situation of colonialism or exile, it's not uncommon for those said people to establish a government in exile to forward the liberation of the nation from which they come. Okay, that's as a part of revolutionary strategies. The UNIA didn't invent the concept of government in exile, but they certainly utilized it because at the end of the day, we're talking about, as I've said, the period just after Africa has been totally colonized and annexed by European powers. The idea is that the authorities on the continent and throughout the African world, as far as colonialism is concerned, are illegitimate. Yes? So we are going to elect, yes, a legitimate government to address our issues of sovereignty and autonomy for our people. All right. So they also developed what is called the Declaration of Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. You can find this online if you want to read it. There is more to be said about this convention. But one of the things I want to highlight is that at this convention, one of the things that was proposed and implemented at a later convention was the Negro Political Union, yes? And the Negro Political Union was about canvassing local communities within particular nation states, yes, to utilize the votes and other civic avenues for the sake of forwarding the agenda of African people specific to that location. So there's supposed to be a Negro political union within every nation state that African people exist, and within every nation state that the UNIA-ACR has branches. So there's supposed to be a Negro political union to forward the agenda of Africans in Jamaica, a Negro political union to forward the agenda of Africans in the United States, in Britain, in the Congo Free State, in South Africa, and so on and so forth. So Pan-Africanism doesn't just deal with the macro and neglect the micro, doesn't just deal with let's all run to Africa without engaging the conditions, the needs of people in the locale that they currently reside. This characterization that I've heard many, many times is a complete fabrication, okay? An absolute fabrication that only the ignorant or the deliberately mischievous are going to promote, because you will not read anywhere in any Pan-African literature, any Pan-African journal, the agenda of any Pan-African movement, yes, leader, scholar, the idea that Africans should not deal with, in the name of being Pan-African, the issues facing African people in the nation in which they reside. This does not exist. And if it does, may I beg you, no, find it for me, come show me. Come on and see it. All right? Okay. One of the other things that UNIA-ACR did was it had an African development program. Yeah. And so its agenda was to relocate its headquarters to the African continent, because the idea was decolonization of Mama Africa. And so the organization had to have its headquarters in Mama Africa because the nation building effort was centered on Mama Africa. And so in 1921, the UNIA sent a delegation to Liberia to begin to prospect for land and opportunities for agricultural and industrial development. In 1922, another delegation was sent. In 1924, 2 delegations were sent. But also the US government sent a man by the name of Henry Firestone, who was a proprietor of the Firestone Rubber Company, to Liberia. Yeah, and Firestone was basically acting, as it says here, you can see again, a relationship between US government and US private corporations, yeah? Unfortunately, a man by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois found himself in the midst of Henry Firestone and the Liberian government at the time, under the leadership of President King, yes, brokering the deal between Firestone and the Liberian government. The issue here is that eventually, the Liberian government gives Henry Firestone a 99-year lease on some land. And I'm forgetting the ridiculous figure, yes? But it was something in the region of 10 cents an acre, some shippiness like that, yeah, that they gave Henry Firestone this land for, 99-year lease. Some of that land was actually land that the UNIA-ACL had already had custodianship of based upon their negotiations with the Liberian government. Yeah. In 1924, the UNIA-ACL sent another delegation. That delegation was led by the woman who you see pictured here, Mama Henrietta Vinton Davis, which is why she's pictured. Okay. I could also call the name of Robert L. Poston, who actually passed away on the return journey. Yes, from pneumonia on the ship on the return journey from this particular trip. The delegation was not allowed, yes, to land. Yeah. And the goods that they had brought were confiscated. They brought $50,000 worth of agricultural and industrial equipment, and they had sent a delegation of agricultural and industrial experts, yes, to develop this land. The plan was to relocate a certain number of families, yeah, onto this land and develop programs in concert with the masses of the people in Liberia, okay? And so we see that this particular program was sabotaged, yeah, by the US government, but this is the nature of the work that the UNIA-ACL was involved in terms of a more radical focus on sovereignty. Now, there are other things that I could look at in terms of what the UNIA-ACL did, but this is not a presentation exclusively about the UNIA-ACL, all right? If you want that, we can go on that still on another day, all right? Okay, so the philosophy underpinning all of this, yeah? The philosophy, and I've given you the resolutions from the Pan-African Congresses, the philosophy underpinning all of this. The program to be explained, Papa Garvey says, in a few words, is that that of universal, industrial, educational, religious, social, and political freedom. The stranger will ask, why should you want political freedom when Victoria of England gave it to you 84 years ago and Lincoln of America 57 years ago? I am tempted to answer for you and to say that the present day Negro does not believe in hypocrisy and camouflage. He believes in truth, in honesty, in justice. The freedom that Lincoln gave us means that half of the population of our race in America is still voteless and voiceless. All of the population of the race in America is deprived of that higher right of citizenship that makes each and everyone equal under the Constitution. These are the things that the Universal Negro Improvement Association questions. These are the things that we are to discuss at our present convention, whether we will accept civilization as it is or put it under a rigid examination to make it what it ought to be as far as our race is concerned. Not only are we not politically and religiously free, as I have aforesaid, but socially we are not free. Economically we are not free. And we of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, who have called you together in this mighty convention, believe that if you must be free, you yourselves must strike the blow. Lincoln can't free you. Victoria of England can't free you. If Negroes must be free, then 400 millions of us must organize the world over and strike the blow for our own freedom, the freedom we desire. So I'm showing you there's a more moderate element and a more radical revolutionary element. Give us a little more rights, sovereignty now. Now, it would be true to say that Marcus Mosiah Garvey himself did not use the term Pan-Afrikanism. As I've already said, terminology that would be used to refer to Garveyism are like universal African nationalism, African fundamentalism, etc. But within the development of Pan-Africanism, there are certain trends that take place. And at a later point, Pan-Africanism becomes an umbrella terminology for referring to various different related sensibilities, Garveyism and the Garvey movement being one such sensibility, and that will become clearer as we go on into the presentation. The primary principles of Garveyism are race first, self-reliance, African spiritual orthodoxy, and nationhood. The goal being nationhood. Nationhood being the ultimate form of human organization. Therefore, it is never enough for us to be treated correct or right or gain greater rights under the nation of other people. However much progress we make within those nations, we must be in pursuit of our own nationhood. That is a Garveyite ideal. All right? So, Queen Mama, Amy Jakes Garvey says that Garveyism is not only a theoretical philosophy, but a working idealism, yes, geared towards the pride needs of an entire race. I'm emphasizing here the idea of working idealism. Yeah, it's theory and practice and the evolution of theory and practice. So you can't just read philosophies and opinions and know Garveyism. You have to study the working actions, the working ideals, the working endeavors of the UNIA-ACL to get a comprehensive understanding. All right, so then now we get to 1945. Yeah, Marcus Mosiah Garvey passes away in 1940. The Garvey movement is still around, but there is a significant decline in its influence. Okay, the Garvey movement is still around today. As I said, I'm a member of the government, all right? However, one of the things that takes place is that in the 1940s, there's a 5th Pan-African Congress, yeah? And that 5th Pan-African Congress is organized by people like George Padmore, C.L.R. James. Mama Amy Jakes Garvey is involved in the organizing of it, but she doesn't attend. Mama Amy Ashwood Garvey, Papa Garvey's first wife, is involved in the organizing of it, and she actually does attend and chairs the first session. W.E.B. Du Bois also attends, although he's not one of the principal organizers of the Congress, but he is respected as the elder, that he was at the time, and the person who kind of basically convened, the previous Pan-African Congresses, okay? This is the main resolution coming out of the 5th Pan-African Congress. It's very important. The delegates of the 5th Pan-African Congress believe in peace. How could it be otherwise? When for centuries, the African peoples have been victims of violence and slavery. Yet, if the Western world is still determined to rule mankind by force, then Africans, as a last resort, may have to appeal to force in the effort to achieve freedom, even if force destroys them and the world. It's a very interesting statement, yeah? It's something similar to what Marcus Garvey said in the 1920s. They go on, we demand Black African autonomy and independence so far and no further than it is possible in this one world for groups and peoples to rule themselves subject to inevitable world unity and federation. We want to rule ourselves. We don't want to rule ourselves beyond, yes, our own national borders, yes, our own jurisdiction, but we want to rule ourselves. And they go on, yeah? Now, this is a very important declaration because as Elder Cecil Duxmore, yeah, historian, activist says, what the 5th Pan-African Congress was a meeting of the minds and a lot of the more moderate forms of Pan-Africanism catching up with the more radical forms of Pan-Africanism that were espoused by Papa Garvey and others, yes? So now, whereas the Pan-African Congresses before were very moderate in their demands, the 5th Pan-African Congress is talking about by any means necessary, freedom no, yeah? It's also important because many of the people that attended this particular conference, namely Kwame Nkrumah, namely Jomo Kenyatta, and others, were people from the continent who would go back to their own nations and would make a serious contribution to the decolonization process that was in train on the African continent. A number of them actually became heads of state, yeah? And so...
Hey, my brother Shakara, before you go in, can you see your Facebook inbox from what you're doing?
I can, yeah.
All right, so let's check that. I just turned over everything to you because I got to make a quick run. But continue, brother.
No problem. I'm there. All right. Blessings. Give thanks, Brother Garfield. All right. Don't worry about it. Me can talk long. Yeah. So I'm there for a little while still. All right. Everything blessed. Excuse me while I take a sip of my lemon and ginger. You know what I mean? All right. Okay. So again, a lot of them go back to the continent and begin to agitate, yeah, for decolonization, for independence, for liberation. You have things like the Mau Mau in Kenya, let's go to war, yeah, with the white man and start bust some throat. And then you have people like Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah who go back to Ghana and starts to engage in what he calls direct action, protest, demonstration, labor organization, and so on and so forth, yeah? Eventually, Ghana becomes the first Black nation in Africa to gain its independence in 1957. And on the 6th of March, 1957, which is the Independence Day of Ghana, the Osagyefo says these words at the independence ceremony. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the entire African continent. Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the entire African continent. Note the juxtaposition between independence and liberation. The point here is that even with independence, the goal, as far as people like Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah are concerned, is not complete. The mission, it's not done yet. Okay? We have independence. Don't mean nothing unless it's linked up with the entire the liberation of the entire African continent. I'm not going to delve too much into this, yeah? But many people are not aware of the achievements of many of our revolutionary leaders, particularly those who are at the helms of nations in Africa and the Caribbean, yeah? This is not to say that they were perfect. This is not to say that they never made any mistakes. This is not even to say that there were things that they did that I might disagree with, yeah? This is to say that they achieved some things that are worthy of note and our appreciation. And too few of us are aware of these things, yeah? So Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah comes to power in 1957 as president. In the space of a decade, yes, less than a decade, he institutes free education from primary to tertiary, including textbooks and compulsory education up to secondary school, yeah, or high school. He builds, or the government builds, hundreds of new schools and increase the number of school places by over 1 million. They build 11 technical colleges, 47 teacher training colleges, 3 new universities, and institute a mass adult literacy program. Yes. They also grant free scholarships for Africans in Ghana to study abroad. And they also, yeah, allow Africans from other parts of the continent to study in Ghana. Yes. He also raised wages for teachers and so on. Yeah. Again, I'm not going to dwell on these things, but it's important for you to know them. They instituted free healthcare. Yeah. There is not a nation in Africa or the Caribbean today, yes, that has healthcare that is free at the point of delivery. Okay. Yeah. And this is in the context of new hospitals that were being built. In 1 decade, yes, under Nkrumah's stewardship, the number of hospital beds in Ghana tripled. Yes, 30 new clinics were built, and the number of doctors were quadrupled, as well as the number of dentists. Yeah, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and so as you can imagine, as a result of all this, life expectancy increased significantly. Economics, yeah. Now we see, let's focus on the fact that, well, he invested in agricultural and industrial development, and over 100 new industries were built, yeah, and developed. And so Ghana began to manufacture glass, sugar, textiles, chocolate, meat, radio, you know, you can read as it goes along here. However, one of the things to note here is that as it stands right now, I don't believe that Ghana itself produces any of these things. And most African nations don't produce any of these things. Most nations in the Caribbean don't produce any of these things, yeah? The chocolate example is particularly important because Ghana, as well as Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, was one of the main centers, if not the main center. Yeah, they were the main center for the export in the cocoa that companies that Cadbury's, yeah, built a fortune off of in terms of creating chocolate, okay? And so Ghana, the president of Ghana just last year, or the year before, made this big announcement that Ghana is going to stop selling its cocoa to Switzerland, and it's going to start manufacturing chocolate in Ghana. They already were doing this under the authority for Kwame Nkrumah. So what happened? And then when you check it now, the company that is manufacturing chocolate in Ghana is owned by some white South Africans. Yeah, some Anglo-Boers, I should say, in South Africa. All right, so what's to say, you know, not everything will look like progress and progress, okay? Let's move forward. A giant dam was built, the Akosombo Dam, in the Volta region, known as the Volta Project, to power energy supply for domestic use and industrial development, exploiting Ghana's vast mineral and agricultural resources. As you can see there, the idea was to harness Ghana's full potential, full industrial and agricultural potential. Reservoirs were built to increase the water supply to towns and villages, as well as the irrigation of agricultural land. Now, this Akosombo Dam project, yeah, was intended to provide power, not just for Ghana, but for surrounding nations in West Africa. And had this been successful, it was eventually sabotaged, yeah, by a cross between, because he engaged British and American investors, yeah, to get this off the ground. And basically, because they were instituting neocolonialism, which we'll get to in a second, they sabotaged the program. Yeah, the dam was eventually built, but not under. What they were scared of is the fact that once it was built, Nkrumah might nationalize the dam and take it out of their private corporations' hands. Yeah, and so they basically didn't want that to take place. However, this would have been the first nation in history to have as its primary power source a renewable energy source, yeah? This world in general, and the Western world in particular, is struggling with that problem today, yeah? There are no nations who use a renewable energy source as their primary energy source. 2-3 generations ago, Africa could and was on the verge of achieving this within the context of a Pan-African revolutionary program, okay? Very important to note. I'm going to leave the rest of the achievements for today, yeah? But just to note, one of the reasons why a lot of this didn't come to full fruition was the fact that Nkrumah, yes, was overthrown by a coup that was sponsored and orchestrated principally by the American government and the British government, yeah? Now, a lot of people say, well, Nkrumah failed, yeah? And they never did this and they never have that and so on and so forth. Well, this is the assessment of Bill Mahoney, yeah? The US ambassador to Ghana, right? Between 1962 and 1965, which is 1965 is the year prior to the overthrow of Nkrumah. He said Nkrumah was everything, politically, economically, culturally, and so on. He thus absolutely dominated the scene. Ghana was singular in the sense that it had everything. It had educated people. It had considerable infrastructure, 3 universities, schools, lawyers, doctors. It had everything going for it. Again, doesn't mean that Ghana was perfect. Again, doesn't mean that there was not going to be, that there were not any challenges. Who, after nearly a century of colonization, is not going to be faced with challenges in developing a nation that is under siege, yes, and so on and so forth. However, even by the assessment of this particular US representative, Ghana had everything go in for it. Assessment of John Stockwell, former CIA agent, come whistleblower. Yes, secret wars of the CIA. He says Howard Bain, who was the CIA station chief in Accra, I should say it was Howard Bain, who was the CIA station chief in Accra, who engineered the overthrow of Nkrumah. Howard Bain got a double promotion and the intelligence star for having overthrown Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. The magic of it, or what made it so exciting for the CIA, is that Howard Bain had enough imagination and drive to run the operation without ever documenting what he was doing. And to sweep along his bosses in such a way, they knew what he was doing, tacitly they approved, but there was not a shred of paper that he generated that would nail the CIA hierarchy as responsible. There's a CIA document, yeah? The person who took over after Nkrumah, and that particular coup was orchestrated through the military and the police. And the person who took over after Nkrumah was a man by the name of General Ankara. General Ankara was identified in a CIA document as a possible successor for Nkrumah in about 2 years at least prior to the coup that eventually overthrew the successor for Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, this is a letter that Nkrumah wrote to President Lyndon Johnson in 1964, yeah? He was overthrown in the year 1966, but he's talking about the CIA operating in Ghana using the US Embassy and attempting to destabilize the nation. I won't read it for the sake of time, but when I can come back, I'll press pause and read it if I want to read it. All right? So, one of the things that Asante for Kwame Nkrumah is known for trying to institute, yes, through the Organization of African Unity, yeah, which was developed in 1963, which was intended to be a body representing the collective will of the independent states of Africa, okay? And what they agreed to do was to work towards decolonizing those nations that were not yet decolonized and to develop some cooperation between them. But the Asante for Kwame Nkrumah was reading the geopolitical science and saying that is not enough. And so what he was proposing, yeah, in 1963, well, even prior to, but certainly in 1963, was for the OAU to develop a number of commissions. Yes, a commission to frame a constitution for the union government of African states, a commission to work out a continent-wide plan for the united or common economic plan for the common economic and industrial program for Africa, yes? And that would include a common market for Africa, an African currency, an African monetary zone, an African central bank, a continental communication system, yeah? And a lot of this, I'll say it in a second, a commission to draw up details for a common foreign policy and diplomacy, a commission to produce plans for a common system of defense, military, a commission to make proposals for common African citizenship. One of the things that we're going to go into a little bit later on is this idea of neocolonialism and what it is, and how after colonialism, when colonialism began to fall, based upon the fight of Africans, yes, particularly during and after mass European War II, the European powers began to recalibrate themselves and try to institute what the Asante for begins to call neocolonialism, okay? And so he's seeing the signs and he's saying, well, none of us could withstand these powers operating in concert and unison with each other if we are operating in fragmented ways, allowing them to pick off one over here, pick off the other over here, and often have us in conflict with each other in support of whatever freedom agenda is. So he's saying now we need a common market to operate and a foreign policy, so we know how we're dealing with the rest of the world. We also need a common defense system, yes, and so on and so forth. And so this was representing some of the more revolutionary thinking at the time on the African continent, yeah? We're gonna go into why this didn't take place a little bit later on, yeah? I hope ones are appreciative, wagwan, right, you know? It's a chronicle of Black nationalist Pan-Africanist revolutionary thought and action, all right? So one of the things that they do is, along with Modibo Keita in Mali and Sékou Touré in Guinea, the Association for Kwame Nkrumah forms the Ghana, Guinea, Mali Union, a proposal and a process to bring those nations under a unified government. He also signs a secret agreement, and that agreement is now known, with Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. They didn't make the agreement public at the time for security reasons, but the agreement said the following: the President of the Republic of Ghana and the Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo, having given serious thought to the idea of African unity, and with the approval of the governments and peoples of their respective states, have decided to establish among themselves a union of African states, and agree as follows: that the union will have a republican constitution within a federal framework, that the federal government will be responsible for foreign affairs, defense, a common currency, economic planning and development, that there will be no customs barriers between any parts of the federation, that there will be a federal parliament and a federal head of state, that the capital of the union will be in Leopoldville, which was what is today Kinshasa in the Congo, yeah? That any state of territory in Africa is free to join this union, and that the above union presupposes Ghana's abandonment of the Commonwealth, yeah? The Commonwealth, which is after Britain, people came out of the British colonization, them going in the British Commonwealth to remain under British stewardship, yeah? So this idea presupposes the idea that Ghana is going to come out of the Commonwealth, yeah? And get rid of the stewardship of Elizabeth of Windsor. Then I'm worried. All right. So as you can see, this is dated the month of August in the year 1960. Yeah? Patrice Lumumba, very, very important. The story goes, to cut a long story short, I shouldn't really say, June 1960, Congo becomes independent. Patrice Lumumba is elected the Prime Minister. At the Independence Day celebrations, for whatever reason, he, the Prime Minister of the country, is not scheduled to speak. He's not been placed on the itinerary to speak. And what happens is Prince Baudouin of Belgium comes and delivers a speech whereby he extols the virtues of King Leopold II, the murderer, the mass murderer, who I referred to earlier, is responsible for halving the population of Congo by murdering 11 to 20 million people. Talking about how the independence of Congo is a part of the dream of King Leopold II, and kind of foolishness. And so Patrice Lumumba, after hearing this, commandeers the platform. Yes? And basically says, no Congolese is going to forget the suffering that the Belgians put us through. He goes on to say the Congo's independence marks a decisive step towards the liberation of the entire African continent. Remember, the Center for Kwame Nkrumah has already, in 1957, already in 1957 said the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the liberation of the entire African continent. Patrice Lumumba says the Congo's independence marks a decisive step towards the liberation of the entire African continent. We are going to show the world what the black man can do when he works in freedom. We are going to make of the Congo the center of the sun's radius for all of Africa. We are going to keep watch over the lands of our country so that they truly profit her children. We are going to restore ancient laws and make new ones, which will be just and noble. The Congo is extremely important because of its vast mineral wealth. Many estimates consider the Congo to be the richest single nation on the planet Earth. 1 million square miles of the richest expanse of land, an estimated $24 trillion worth of mineral resources. Yes, diamond, gold, silver, copper, oil, coltan, cobalt, manganese, iron ore, chrome, uranium. Bear those minerals in mind. We're going to come back to them a little bit later. 8 million hectares, which is 307,000 square miles of arable land producing all kind of different things. I met a Congolese brother one time and said, you know what, when you get there, Congo, you just throw something on the ground and it grow. And I said, yeah, tree, big stuff. All right. Millions of acres of forestry and a colossal source of timber and a vast rubber supply. What this technical thing is that's storing behind it is the fact that it is said that Congo alone has the capacity to grow enough food to feed the entire planet up until the year 2050. All right. So we consider Congo to be the geological miracle in the heart of Africa. Congo being central to Africa, having a connection to 9 surrounding countries and so on and so forth, was very strategic for the commandeering of the Western powers, but also very strategic for forwarding an African liberation agenda. Yeah, so they were very concerned about Patrice Lumumba. And so they began to label him, because after Mass European War II, what we was now in is this era called the Cold War. Russia and America, Eastern Europe and Western Europe are trying to exert their influence on the African continent and ensure that all of us support either the West or the East. And Nkrumah, Lumumba, and others are saying, we're not aligned. Yeah, we're not aligned to capitalist America. We're not aligned to communist Russia. We're charting our own course for development. So one of the tools that the Americans use and the British use to give them a justification for meddling in the affairs of another nation is the idea that the nation is dealing with communism, that they're under the influence of the Russians. Yeah, and so they levied this charge at Baba Patrice Lumumba. It was a false charge. Yeah, Patrice Lumumba was not a communist. Patrice Lumumba was not under the influence of the Russians. All Africans, on the basis of self-determination, exercise the right to do business with who we choose to do business with. But that doesn't mean that we're forwarding the political agenda of the people that we're doing business with, necessarily. Some of us are, but not necessarily. All right? And so this was a justification that was used to meddle in the affairs of the Congo. To cut a long story short, Papa Patrice Lumumba is assassinated 6 months later in January of 1961. And that particular assassination, again, is orchestrated by the Belgians, the USA, the UK, France, and with the tacit approval of the United Nations. And if you understand that the United Nations was established by the USA in the first place anyway, that should not surprise us, yeah? And so the traitors that were used were people like Joseph Kasavubu, Moise Shombe, Albert Kalanji, yeah? And the infamous Joseph Mobutu, who then becomes the head of state. And he is maintained, yes, in power by the US and France from 1965 officially, although he was really the power behind the power before then, but officially between 1965 and 1997, when they finally got rid of him. Yes? But Joseph Mobutu was a brutal neo-colonial puppet in Congo And he could not have maintained his power in the Congo had it not been for the assistance, yes, of the USA and France in particular. All right, and we know this because of the fact that when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in 1961, just a couple years later, a rebellion kicked off. Really two different rebellions that were related to each other. The Simba Rebellion and the Kwilu Rebellion, yeah? The latter being led by Pierre Molele, who was a Lumumbaist, yes? And in a matter of weeks, the people that were a part of this rebellion had basically taken back somewhere in the region of half the Congo from the neo-colonial government. So what you see in blue, yeah, well, what you see in red is where the Simba Rebellion was kicking off and where they had exerted power and reclaimed the land and the nation from the neo-colonial government. And what you see in yellow is the Kwilu element of the rebellion, which as you can see is closer to the capital city, which is Leopoldville. So they were extremely concerned about this rebellion reaching what was then called Leopoldville. Yeah, they were very, very concerned about this, yeah? But the point here is that Africans, when revolutionary progressive governments were overthrown, rebelled against the governments themselves, yes? Rebelled against the so-called corrupt African leaders, rebelled against the armies and the police forces that were under these corrupt governments, and did so with significant success. But what happened? What happened was, stick a pin, we're going to come back to what happened. Yeah? We're going to come back to what happened. All right? We're going to get into this in a second. For now, let's talk about what's taking place in the United States of America at the same time. What's taking place, well, many things are taking place, but one of the most notable things that are taking place is that Omowale Malcolm X is founding and establishing the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The aims and objectives of the Organization of Afro-American Unity read in relation to its establishment, that upon this establishment, the Afro-American people will launch a cultural revolution which will provide a means for restoring our identity, that we might rejoin our brothers, which will provide the means for restoring our identity, that we might rejoin our brothers and sisters on the African continent, culturally, psychologically, economically, and share with them the sweet fruits of freedom from oppression and independence of racist governments. Now notice, he said, culturally, psychologically, economically. He never said we are going to run Ghana, Africa tomorrow. Yeah, this is a caricature that is popular, but largely fallacious. That doesn't mean that none of we are going to go to Africa, but this idea that the only agenda is just fly by Africa and done is nonsense. All right, there's a political, a psychological, a cultural, an economical element to this thing. Okay, so we're just pointing out that Omowale Malcolm X at the same time is founding the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Yeah, and we're going to hear from Omowale Malcolm X now.
And one of the things that's going to help to bring this about is the independence of Africa. One of the only reasons that we in the West have never organized, we have hated our image and our African image. And because Africa has been in the hands of people who have created an image of Africa that's negative and hateful. And it has been hateful to us. We haven't wanted to identify with it. But now that Africa is getting independent and in a position to create its own image, and it's a positive image, those of us in the West look at the African image and see how positive it is. we begin to identify with it. We become proud of Africa, and we become proud of our African blood, our African heritage. And this is what is beginning to make the Africans in the Western Hemisphere today develop more race pride. And as this race pride develops, then it has a tendency to make us want to unite together and work together. And your Western imperialists and colonialists consider this to be a grave threat, more threat than communism or Marxism or socialism or anything else. The Africanism is what they consider to be the real threat.
So you can see who he's got on the wall here. Yeah, that is Papa Patrice Lumumba. Yeah, and I do believe that he's being interviewed by some students from Congo at this time. Yeah, in this particular video. So focusing specifically on what he said at the end there. Yeah, that Africanism is what the imperialist powers, the pan-European axis, the Western imperialist axis considers to be the real threat. Yes, they don't want a coalition or organization of the African masses across the world because they consider it a threat to the hegemony of the West in the world. He also says that Africanism is what they consider to be the real threat, more threat than socialism or Marxism or any other kind of ism. Africanism is what they consider to be the real threat. It's a very interesting statement. Yeah, let's go forward and hear a little more from the man called Omowale Malcolm X.
Most people, when we say Afro-American, they think only of the Negroes in the United States, but they don't realize that 2/3 of Brazil consists of people of African blood, which means they're also Afro-American because Brazil is in South America. And in all of these, many of these countries in South America and Central America, and even in Canada, they are heavily populated with people whose ancestors came from Africa. So when you total up the number of Afro-Americans, real Afro-Americans, in the Western Hemisphere, there are perhaps 100 million. And if these people ever unite among themselves, not only is it necessary for the Afro-American in the United States to be organized, but it's also necessary for the Afro-Americans in the Caribbean, or the Afro-Cubans, the Afro-Brazilians. It's necessary for all of them to be organized. And then once they are organized in each place, we have to organize among ourselves so that the Afro-American in the United States will be working in conjunction in a coordinated program with those who are in Cuba and those in Brazil and those in Venezuela and those throughout the Caribbean and Haiti and in the West Indian Islands. And in this way, we actually get strength. And it's not an accident that there's no organization existing in the Western Hemisphere that's designed toward that end. It would be a direct threat to imperialism as it really exists and to colonialism as it exists in the West.
So again, we hear Omowale Malcolm X identifying the Western imperialists. We also hear him identifying and defining the term Afro-American or African-American. He doesn't define it simply as confined to the Africans in the borders of the United States of America. Yes? By not confining what an African-American is to the United States of America, what he has done is negate the jurisdiction of the United States as a geopolitical entity in defining and governing the destiny of Africans in America. That the destiny of Africans in America is not going to be defined by the American government and its jurisdiction, but by an organized force of African people, beginning with Africans in America, connected to Africans throughout the Americas. He has internationalized the identity of African people in the Americas to the extent that none of us are subject to the colonial machinations of Britain or France, as many of our nations in the Caribbean were still colonized by Britain and France at this time. He has internationalized our identity so that we see ourselves in concert with our brothers and sisters. We in the Caribbean see ourselves in concert with our brothers and sisters in the United States of America, in Canada, and in the island them where we don't live. if we live in a white majority country, he has made us, with this terminology and this definition, not an ethnic minority, but as a part of a global majority. Yes, and again, the idea is that this form of organization is a threat to the power and the hegemony of Western imperialists, of the pan-European axis that has dominated Africa and African people through colonization, enslavement, and at this particular point in history is instituting neocolonialism. Let's go forward. So, remember I said stick a pin, yeah? What happened, yeah, in the Congo, yeah, with the Simba rebellion and the Kwilu rebellion? Well, in the Judas Factor, written by Carl Evans, we are informed Malcolm X returned from Africa on November the 24th, 1964. Arriving in New York that evening, he was greeted by about 60 of his followers. 24 hours earlier, President Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, yes, had ordered airstrikes in the Congo to rescue, this is the pretext, 1,700 Americans and Europeans. So even if I'm going to just go for the American, I'm going for the European them too, whose lives were in jeopardy due to the civil war that had broken out after the collapse of the Congolese government. Civil war was the Simba Kwilu rebellion. The government was in jeopardy. Lyndon B. Johnson sent in the troops, not to get the Americans and the Europeans out, but to support the government, the corrupt government that was then headed by Moise Tshombe. Yes, one of the people that was responsible for the assassination of Papa Patrice Lumumba, working for the Belgians and the French and so on. And we know this because up until last year, yes, what happens is they kill Patrice Lumumba, they shoot him dead, and they decide his body is handed over to the Belgian forces. They decide they don't want a trace of his body to remain. They don't want his gravesite to become a shrine for the Africans in the Congo. So they douse his body in acid and dissolve the body to the point that only his teeth, his two front teeth, are remaining. And the wicked devil them, yes, take the teeth of Patrice Lumumba back to Belgium. There's a documentary on his assassination where the boy, the agent boy, actually has the teeth of Patrice Lumumba in his hand, gloating. Yeah, and the only blessing that comes out of that scenario is that we know exactly who do it and who the people them, the sellout in Africa, in the Congo, who they were working on behalf of. But last year, those teeth were finally returned back to the Congo where they belong. All right, just last year now, yeah, from 1961 until 2021, the only remains of Papa Patrice Lumumba were in Belgium. It's terrible, yeah? So this looks like it now a play, which is most unfortunate. But this is a video of Omowale Malcolm X, yeah, licking out against what America was doing in the Congo and charging America with criminality for its acts, yeah, of sending mercenaries and backing Moise Tshombe, bringing Anglo-Boer mercenaries from South Africa to defend the corrupt colonial puppet regime in the Congo in the 1960s. And he's buying up America to its support of that regime, yeah? And so it would have been good for you to hear that video, but it looks like it's not playing. But I've made the point anyway, but it goes deeper than that. Listen to this. On the 28th of remember, Omowale Malcolm X lands back in New York on the 24th of November, 1964. On the 28th of November, President Johnson and Secretary of State Dean Rusk received letters condemning US support for the CIA-backed regime in the Congo. Listen carefully now. Requesting the administration to withdraw its support and to revise its foreign policy towards the Congo. The letters were signed by the following civil rights leaders: James Farmer of CORE, Dorothy Height, President of the National Council of Negro Women, A. Philip Randolph, President of the Negro American Labor Council, Whitney M. Young Jr., Executive Director of the National Urban League, Roy A. Wilkins, Executive Secretary of the NAACP, and Dr. Martin Luther King, President of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. Why is that important? This said civil rights leaders. It didn't say Pan-Africanists. It didn't say socialist, communist revolutionaries. It never said Black power advocates. It says civil rights leaders. At this time, one of the strategies that Omowale Malcolm X is employing is that he wants to bring the case of Africans in America before the United Nations. The logic behind this is the number of African nations that are becoming independent and are able to represent a bloc within the United Nations to exert some international pressure on America. So he's got a twofold thing here. He's trying, on the one hand, to get the civil rights leaders who are more moderate than him. These are leaders who he's had many criticisms for, and they have had many criticisms of him. These are the integrationist leaders that Omowale Malcolm X is very famous for having criticized. These are the leaders that criticize anything too radical, anything Black nationalist, anything revolutionary. Yes? But there's a diplomacy going on whereby Omowale Malcolm X is negotiating and building relationships with them so that they can support his petition or the OAU's petition to the United Nations. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, Omowale Malcolm X is attempting to get the leaders, particularly the revolutionary leaders among the independent African nations, to back the particular petition and exert international pressure on the American government. So when the American government begins to receive letters from the moderate integrationist leaders, they're seeing the signs of danger. They already know Omowale Malcolm X's position. Since the death of Patrice Lumumba, he's been budding up the American government and the sellout puppet regime in the Congo. They already know his position. But these letters, and those who signed them suggest that even the more moderate leaders in America among Africans are in support of at least some of what Omowale Malcolm X is dealing with. That's a go on. Right, you know. Let's go forward. Reading again from the Judas Factor. Yeah. So what happened with all of this? When Malcolm X returned, sorry, I should say, in relation to the Simba Kwedu rebellion, it was eventually crushed. Why? Because obviously American military support shifted the balance of resources. Yes, America paid mercenaries, funded them with weapons and so on and so forth. Yeah, and eventually orchestrated, so it was Mobutu who made Moise Tshombe the head of state at that time. Afterwards, he go against Moise Tshombe and he becomes the premier in 1965 with the support of America, with the support of France, with the support of Britain. So Africans within our own sensibilities were expressing and demonstrating the capacity to deal with the neo-colonial corrupt leaders that were put in place to govern us in the interest of Western imperialists. The Western imperialists then comes back in to support their puppets. Yeah, and that one, right? I know. Yeah, so continuing in the Judas factor, when Malcolm returned from Africa in May after his first trip, he claimed that not only had the OAU agreed to act upon his resolution, requesting them to interject the Negro problem into the UN debates, but that they intended by year's end to advance his second proposal by labeling America as much a colonial power as South Africa. South Africa was deep in the apartheid thing at this point, okay? It was December 22nd, yeah? This is the United Nations now meeting, yes, in New York at this time. Yet no mention had been made at the UN of America being a colonialist. To the horror and complete surprise of the Johnson administration, the situation suddenly changed, thereby establishing Malcolm X as a leader of Africans as well as African Americans, and to the intelligence community, a major threat to national security. A story in the December 22nd New York Times describes it best, and he doesn't quote the full article. So we're gonna find the article, and I've quoted it more extensively. Yeah, he says, the United States, which until recently was censured by other Western countries for fostering the independence of territories that were presumably not ready for it, is now finding itself criticized as a colonial power. Charges of colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism are being levied at the United States in the 24-member United Nations Special Committee on Colonialism. Although the United States officials at the United Nations state emphatically that the United Nations that the United States is not a colonial power, the newly independent states of Asia and Africa are, quote, passionately intent on freeing all lands that are not entirely self-governing, whether they want independence or not, according to one United States spokesman. So what happened is that representatives from nations like Kenya and Ghana, yeah, and a couple other African nations, yeah, began to compare America to South Africa and ask questions like, why is it the Americans support the apartheid government in South Africa? Is it because the people in South Africa look like the people in Harlem and Los Angeles and Detroit? Yeah, they start to use the word colonialism to refer to America and its treatment of Africans in America. Another day we'll go deeper into exactly what happened, yeah, at this UN meeting, all right? But that's a one, yeah? So we're seeing a level of organization taking place among Africans around the diaspora, and it's beginning to yield some organizational fruits. So what's happening is that these European powers, as I said before, are instituting neocolonialism, yeah? And you notice I'm not delving deep into every single aspect of the chronicle. We can do that at another point, all right? Each of these stories is a presentation in and of itself, okay? But in 1965, the same year that Omowale Malcolm X is assassinated, and a year before, he himself, the Center for Kwame Nkrumah, is overthrown in that coup that I mentioned earlier. He publishes a book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. What he does basically is define what is currently taking place on the African continent and what is about to take place on the African continent in terms of the instituting of neocolonialism. The book is prophetic when you consider that it was written in 1965, and it very much describes a lot of what is taking place, not just on the African continent, but in every majority black nation around the world at this time right here now. He defines neocolonialism. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it, is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside, yeah? So this is different to them come at your land and stick a flag in your land. What they do now is send their corporations, is send their multilateral organizations, yes, to come and commandeer your economy, yeah? is send their military, yes, to come and annex your resources and protect them for the sake of the corporation, and so on and so forth. The methods and forms of this direction can take various shapes. For example, in an extreme case, the troops of the imperial power may garrison the territory of the neocolonial state and control the government of it, Congo. More often, however, neocolonist control is exercised through economic or monetary means. The neocolonial state may be obliged to take the manufactured products of the imperialist power to the exclusion of competing products from elsewhere. Control over government policy in the neocolonial state may be secured by payments towards the cost of running the state. They'll pay for you for your administrative costs. By the provision of civil servants in positions where they can dictate policy, and by the monetary control of foreign exchange through the imposition of banking, of a banking system controlled by the imperial power. Yeah? These are the examples of how neocolonialism is instituted. As I move towards the close, we're going to give some examples of how this has manifested since the 1960s up until now and continues to manifest to this day. So one of the major ways was through the development of what is called Bretton Woods institutions. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management was established established the rules for commercial and financial relations among the United States, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan after 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. Yeah, so this is coming towards a conclusion of the Second Mass European War, misnomer World War. Yeah, and basically they're looking to develop these economic relationships through which they can build back, yes, Europe. And they've understood, one, that it's better to do this together. None of them had the wherewithal to develop themselves by themselves because they were all mashed up, apart from really America after the war. Yeah, and also that nations that have deep economic relationships are less likely to go to war with each other. Okay, and so the Bretton Woods system was the first example of a fully negotiated monetary order intended to govern monetary relations among independent states. The primary institutions were the International Monetary Fund, also known as the IMF, and the World Bank. And then you can later on, you can add to that the World Trade Organization, the Council on Foreign Relations. I think already exists by this point, but it's actually all up in this mix. Yeah, and again, the American government is central to the creation of these institutions. In fact, there is evidence that as far, even back to 1940, 1941, they were already prospecting towards exerting their economic influence on the world through institutions like these. And the World War II, Mass European War II context gave them the excuse for doing so. All right. In this book, Black Power, yes, the Politics of Revolution in America, written by Stokely Carmichael, then known as Stokely Carmichael, more properly referred to as Kwame Ture, and Charles V. Hamilton, they put forward the idea that, as well as the fact that Africans on the continent and in the Caribbean are colonized, Africans in America are also colonized, yes, also represent a colonized community, a colonized nation. And they refer to this as internal colonialism. Because of time, not going to go into all of this, but I want to note this analysis of the condition of Africans in America coming out of the inspiration of Omowale Malcolm X. And what they consider and likening it to the colonialism that was being experienced by Africans on the continent and in the Caribbean. All right, so, okay, we're soon done, yeah? In this book, The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, the Associate for Kwame Nkrumah engages an analysis of what he calls sham independence, yeah? And the fact that what happened on the African continent largely became sham independence because of the level of colonially minded Africans who either came into power or were put into power by Western imperialists. He says, a close analysis of the specific conditions under which each one of the 13 states became independent reveals that neocolonialism was incipient during the movement for independence and emerged fully once independence was acquired. Few were deceived by such a deliberate and obvious strategy. Imperialism was merely using the device of sham independence, to prepare the African terrain to suit its own convenience and to avoid a direct and costly confrontation with the liberation movements. It was therefore not surprising that the divisions of opinion on the question of unity expressed in Saniquel were much more in evidence during the second conference of independent African states held in Addis Ababa in 1960. Yeah, so that's the same place where I told you that he was trying to put forward the agenda of common market, common military, so on and so forth. Yeah, all right. Let's listen carefully. So he's saying at subsequent meetings, yeah, he's saying the pivot of African unity was no longer seen as a firm political union, but merely as a loose policy of cooperation between African states. So instead of the hard line, we need to form a political union for collective development and self-defense, let's have a loose, relationship of, cooperation, all right? Moreover, the concept of regional groupings between states was endorsed, yeah? So East African community, West African community, rather than a more continental. And there are debates around continental versus, I'm a Black nationalist Pan-Africanist, so I want unity among Black Africans, all right? But that's another subject for another time. The point is that the agenda here was maximum self-defense strategy and protection, okay? The principle of collective foreign policy was agreed upon in Accra in 1958, gave way to the principle of a separate foreign policy for each state. So instead of having a collective foreign policy, we are all going to speak to Britain and America and France and so on and so forth with one voice. Now, what's the word? Ivory Coast is going to do it by itself. Yeah, Congo's going to do it by itself. Kenya's going to do it by itself. Tanzania's going to do it by itself. Uganda's going to do it by itself. Sudan's going to do it by itself. Yeah. In this way, imperialists gain more room to maneuver for infiltration and for stirring up difficulties between African states. It was agreed that the assistance, Rongo come get Zulu. It was agreed that the assistance to the Algerian liberation struggle was to take the form of diplomatic pressure on France, but was to bypass official recognition of the GPRNA, which is the provisional government in Algeria. In plain words, diplomatic shilly-shallying was to take the place of anti-imperialist confrontation. Yeah, so they weren't defending the movements in the way they should have defended the movements that were moving against colonization and imperialism. Therefore, as early as 1960, a wide gulf developed between those independent states which favored cooperation with imperialism and those which proclaimed an unflinching offensive against it. This is typically characterized as the Casablanca bloc versus the Monrovia bloc. Monrovia being the more moderate, colonially minded, neo-colonized nation states. Casablanca being the more revolutionary minded. That's how it's typically depicted. Yeah. The emergence of conflicting trends, and I'm giving you this because this is Kwame Nkrumah's own assessment of what was taking place at this time, but it also gives us the ideas, the conflicting thoughts and ideas that were present, yeah, in the various different movements. Was fortuitous but a logical consequence of the state of tension between qualitatively different situations. One, genuine independence, the product of a mass political movement or an armed liberation struggle. Two, sham independence established by imperialists in an attempt to arrest the progress of the people's movement through a betrayal of its essential objectives. Point being, Africa had its revolutionaries and its sellouts, just like Africans everywhere in the world have our revolutionaries and our sellouts. For the sake of time, I am not going to read the rest of these beautiful slides taken from the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare by the Association for Kwame Nkrumah, except to say that his strategy for addressing all of this was many-fold, but one of them was political military organization, and that called for the establishment and the formation of an All-African People's Revolutionary Party, and also the creation of an All-African People's Revolutionary Army. The All-African People's Revolutionary Party is an organization that exists to this day, and its most well-known leader was a now ancestor by the name of Kwame Ture, who I mentioned earlier. All right, so one of the things that the French did in terms of instituting neocolonialism was institute a thing called the independence package, yeah, which they offered to their former colonies to ensure that they are able to maintain their power. I'm not going to go into all of this at the moment, but just to say that the result of this independence package, yeah, the only person to absolutely refuse it was Sékou Touré in Guinea. And then there were those like Sylvian Olympia in Togo, yeah, who accepted it at one point, but then started to print, yeah, started to negate it by printing Togo's own currency, yes, in Togo, as opposed to getting the French currency, yeah, from France. And he was assassinated, yeah, for doing so, okay, in Togo, all right? But the countries that are still bound up in these agreements today, yes, with France are Benin, Burkina Faso, Guinea-Bissau, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, Togo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Congo, Brazzaville, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Their currency is tied to the French currency. What's the franc? Now it's the euro. Their currency is printed in France. They all deposit collectively over $500 billion into the French central bank. The French have an influence in the elections in all of these nations. They also have a first right of refusal over any natural resources found, yes, in these nations. A number of leaders of these nations have gotten sick and tired of some of their machinations. They were mostly neo-colonial, but some of them say, well, no, we don't want the French currency again. And a few of them have been overthrown as a result, yeah, of just getting tired of the French currency, all right? Another day, we'll go into that story there, look more. Big up the brother Sékou, because Sékou has told at least one of the stories in relation to Gabon, yeah? Okay, let's go. So that's the situation right now in these African nations. And we know that why France is holding on, because from long time till now, yeah, their presidents have been asserting the fact that without Africa, France ain't nobody. Yeah, without Africa, France will slide down into the rank of a third world power. That was Jacques Chirac in March 2008. But generation or two before, without Africa, France will have no history in the 21st century. That's Francois Mitterrand in 1957. I want you to note these names. Yeah, I could tell you a story or two about Brother Kemi Seba. Have the pleasure of meeting the brother and co-hosting an event at which he spoke here in London. All right, but Sister Natalie Yam and Kemi Seba are leaders of mass movements across French-speaking West Africa that are campaigning against French incursion, the CFA Franc in particular, and the French military presence within French-speaking West African nations in general, most of which are in West and Central Africa. All right, so I'm just pointing this out so you note these names, you can do your own research on them, yeah? Now, two assassinations in the 1980s that are important to the story. One is that of Maurice Bishop, and the other is that of Thomas Sankara. Maurice Bishop is of Grenada in the Caribbean. Thomas Sankara is of Burkina Faso in West Africa, yeah? They both achieved many things at the helm of their nation. Both of them were allowed to be in power for 4 years before they were assassinated. And it's very interesting, the similarities between their stories. Maurice Bishop was assassinated in 1983. Thomas Sankara was assassinated in 1987, yeah? I'll give you one example. Thomas Sankara was able to make the nation of Burkina Faso food self-sufficient in the space of 4 years between 1983 and 1987 without accepting a French loan, an American loan, an IMF loan, a World Bank loan. He rejected all the loans and was able to grow enough food in the nation to make the nation food self-sufficient. Then I'm worried. We're gonna hear the voice of Maurice Bishop first, where he's speaking at Hunter College in New York in 1983, June 1983, but months before he was assassinated. And hear the words of Maurice Bishop.
They give all kinds.
So he's about to speak about a CIA report that he received from the American government. He's gone there because the American government are acting very hostile towards the revolutionary government in Grenada, and he's trying to engage in some diplomatic talks and so on and so forth. So he's saying they give all kinds of reasons here for their hostility towards our government, and he's going to explain them now.
Of reasons and excuses, some of them credible, some utter rubbish. There's an interesting one that we saw very recently in a secret report of the State Department. I want to tell you about that one, so you can reflect on that one. That secret report made this point, that Grenada is different to Cuba and Nicaragua. And the Grenada Revolution is in one sense even worse, using their language, than the Cuban and Nicaraguan revolutions, because the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada speaks English and therefore can communicate directly to the people of the United States.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's going to be it for us here.
I can see from your applause, sister and brothers, that you agree with the report. But I want to tell you what that same report also said, and said that also made us very dangerous. And that is that the people of Grenada and the leadership of Grenada are predominantly Black. They said that 95% of our population is Black, and they had a correct statistic. And if we have 95% of predominantly African origin in our country, then we can have a dangerous appeal to 30 million Black people in the United States.
Okay, I said, am I muted? Oh, no, I'm not muted. Good. All right. So on another day, yeah, we'll go into what the significance of the Grenada Revolution is and why it was so important and why the whole room of Africans there are so in celebration of seeing Maurice Bishop and hearing what he said. Yeah, it's very, very important aspect of our history. It's not even too long ago. Yeah, I'm sure most of the people listening were alive in 1983. Yeah, so it's not too long ago. However, the point he's making has already been made, yes, by Malcolm X before him, that this connection of Africans in America to Africans in Grenada, like a small island, so-called, of Grenada, yes, is considered to be a threat to the national security of big bad America. Them no one that for take place. All right? And then, as I said, Maurice Bishop is assassinated in October 1963. He's assassinated as a result of a very confusing situation that surrounded the implosion of the revolutionary government, and the exact circumstances of what led to his assassination or who orchestrated it is not fully well known. What is known is that 6 days later, the American government invaded the island of Haiti. What is known, Grenada. What is known is that from the revolution kicked off in 1979, and at least as early as 1980, the American government were conducting military drills for an invasion of Grenada. What is clear is that prior to the assassination of Maurice Bishop, the American government was putting out the propaganda that Grenada's attempt to build an international airport was an attempt to create a military base, yeah, for Russian weaponry and military invasion of America. That they could launch the Russians could launch an invasion of America from Grenada, and kind of stripping this, yeah. And so they invade Grenada 6 days after Maurice Bishop is assassinated, and occupy the nation for a significant period of time, and ensure that it falls under the influence politically and economically of America, yeah, and Britain, because it was and remains a Commonwealth nation. All right. So next, I'm going to show you a video of Thomas Sankara in Harlem in 1984, I believe, yeah, a few years before he's assassinated. And he's speaking about his connection with Maurice Bishop.
L'année dernière, j'ai rencontré Bishop Maurice. Last year, I met Maurice Bishop. Nous avons discuté longuement. We discussed for a long time. Et nous nous sommes donné mutuellement des conseils. We advised each other. Quand je suis rentré dans mon pays, j'ai été arrêté par l'impérialisme. As soon as I went back home, imperialists arrested me. J'ai pensé à Maurice Bishop. I thought about Maurice Bishop. Quelque temps après, j'ai pu être délivré de prison. Sometime later, I was freed from jail. Grâce à la mobilisation de la population. Thanks to the people's mobilization. Et j'ai pensé encore à Maurice Bishop. Once again, I thought about Bishop. J'ai préparé pour lui une lettre. I wrote him a letter. Je n'ai pas eu l'occasion de la lui envoyer. I never had the chance to send it to him. Là encore à cause de l'impérialisme. Once again, because of imperialism. Alors nous avons compris qu'il faut désormais lutter contre l'impérialisme sans relâche. I understood that we must relentlessly fight against imperialism. Si nous ne voulons pas que demain on assassine encore des Maurice Bishop, il faut que nous nous mobilisions dès aujourd'hui. If we don't want any more assassinations against other bishops, we must be organized today. Et c'est pourquoi je vais vous montrer que je suis prêt contre l'impérialisme. That's why I'm going to show you that I'm ready for imperialism.
But for those who know Sigurd, he's in draft him gone, yeah, in draft him gone. I'm sure people him, you know, in ready for imperialism. Just to say that you can read this speech, this entire speech in a book called Thomas Sankara Speaks, and you will see that, you know, he talks about solidarity between between the people of Burkina Faso and the Africans of America, in particular Harlem, and you know, and so on and so forth. He's one of many African leaders who have traveled to the United States and you know, demonstrated this solidarity. Yeah, Baba Amilcar Cabral is another who did similar. And so on, yeah. So I'm nearly done. some of today's challenges, yeah? We have to look at the fact that, as you can see in the heading is, today's challenges for Black nationalist Pan-Africanists. We see at the end of last year that they had this US Africa Leaders Summit, yeah? Which is a big pantomime in neocolonialism and Western imperialist genuflection, yeah? First and foremost, we have to understand that this particular conference or summit was called because the America considers itself and the West considers itself to be losing ground and influence as far as African nations are concerned because of the rise of China economically. And so they've gone in with the intention, and sometimes the expressed intention, if you look at a lot of its major companies like Apple and Tesla and so on and so forth, the development, the digital revolution in Europe and in the West is reliant upon the minerals of the African continent and like the cobalt, the coltan, the uranium, and so on and so forth. Yeah, that was mentioned earlier. Okay, and so this is what this pantomime was all about. Yeah, reasserting America's influence on the world, and you can see the whole of the neo-colonial leaders come out, yeah, to be lapdogs for America and their corporations. Sometimes they co-opt Pan-African language, yeah, in doing so. You know, so they'll meet, yeah, as a part of the East African economic community, and there are some good things about that. But essentially, all of those nations are neo-colonial regimes, and so the association itself has to be neo-colonial, and it's about developing relationships that make it easier for the movement of goods and services of European neo-colonial corporations. That's essentially what it equals. And when we have more time, we'll go into the details of that a little more. Yeah, and that is again taking place within this context of the new scramble for Africa's resources. And I'm going to give you one example of this right now. This is taken from a document called We Charge Colonialism, written by a coalition of organizations coming under the banner of the Pan-African Unity Movement for Development. It says, in 2021, imperialism still pervades on the African continent. The case of Vedanta Resources, majority owner of Konkola Copper Mines, KCM, Zambia's largest copper production mine, exemplifies the point. In the 90s, it took advantage of Zambia's economic crisis to purchase Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines. Yeah, the development agreement, quote unquote, that secured the deal committed them through this KCM to paying mineral royalties of just 0.6% in an industry where 5 to 10% had been the average. Okay, hold up, that's clear. In 2006 to 2007, they paid the Zambian government just 6.1 million on over 1 billion in extracted copper ore. The agreement had also written in it a 20-year stability period to safeguard against future policy reform. So that the agreement means that the Zambian government cannot change its economic policies because it will be in breach of this agreement with this particular foreign corporation. Yeah. These are the kinds of neo-colonial machinations that go on. The impact of these decisions are a perpetual state of underdevelopment, crippling Africa's ability to fund public service provision and develop their economies. Compounding that is the environmental damage. KCM have also been implicated in serious incidents of environmental mismanagement and compromising the health of locals. The most serious being when sulfur dioxide emissions from its smelters were being released into drinking water and silting local rivers. Accusations of labor rights abuses and draconian employment practices persist too. Laborers are said to be paid as little as £37 a month, 114 below the country's average living expense of £150.36 a month. It is a mistake to believe Britain's colonial tendencies are a thing of the past. In 2013, during the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition, the government created the High-Level Propensity Partnership Initiative, an initiative to enable British companies access to the continent's raw materials in exchange for British aid. Yeah, I'm just pointing these things out for you know the current context, and this particular situation replicates itself in relation to diamonds and coltan in Congo, oil in Nigeria, gold in South Africa, banana throughout the Caribbean, bauxite and timber, and so on and so forth throughout the Americas. Yes, I'm going to skip that particular slide. Another example is this report, the new colonialism. Britain's scramble for Africa's energy and mineral resources. This report reveals the degree to which British companies now control Africa's key mineral resources. I'll skip to the middle. It says it finds that 101 companies have mining operations in 37 sub-Saharan African countries. These companies, which are mainly British, now control an identified 1.5 trillion worth of resources in Africa in just 5 commodities: oil, gold, diamonds, coal, and platinum. All right, that's not to mention the coltan, the cobalt, the lithium, the uranium, the etc., the etc., the etc. Okay. Then now we also have military expansion continuing to take place throughout the world, in fact, on the African continent and throughout the Caribbean. The main instruments of this are AFRICOM and NATO. AFRICOM is the US Military High Command. NATO, for those who may not be aware, is the North African Treaty Organization, which is a military alliance between some 30-something countries, mostly European, and it's orchestrated by Britain and America in particular. And it's basically a military alliance between those nations. It's basically NATO that Russia is at war with in Ukraine right about now, because NATO is supporting the Ukraine. AFRICOM, the US Military High Command, has 29 bases all over the African continent, and is one of between 7 and 11 military high commands that the American government has, military bases all over the world. So basically the American government has separated the world, and into commands of its military bases, and AFRICOM is one. And the current head of the AFRICOM is US Marine Corps General Michael Langley. So we're living in a time whereby Western imperialist nations are going into overdrive to co-opt Africans into their imperialist machinations. In fact, I'll tell you better than that. I mentioned Grenada a minute ago. In 1983, when America invaded, Jamaica supported the invasion. Barbados supported the invasion. Dominica supported the invasion. In fact, when Ronald Reagan announced the invasion, Eugenia Charles, the head of state in Dominica, was standing right by his side. Jamaica assisted America with military personnel, to invade Grenada in 1983. The person who led the operation was a man by the name of Colin Powell, who later became the Secretary of State under George Herbert Walker Bush. So now we have Marine Corps General Michael Langley. So Britain, America, France want to buy the allegiance of Africans and absorb us into the neo-colonial imperialist agenda, whereby we can lead the military high command against our own brothers and sisters around the world. And one of the ways in which they do this is to get us more and more to identify with their nationalities, to identify with freedom identity, British, French, American. This is important for us to note because of the fact that in Blueprint for Black Power, Baba Amos Wilson cites the work of a European by the name of Joel Kotkin in a book called Global Tribes. Sorry, Tribes, the book is called, and I'm forgetting the subheading, but he refers to them as global tribes and gives an explanation of how some of them are gaining power in today's world. He identifies a number of different groups of people, and he identifies a strong identity, a global network, and a passion for technological knowledge and advancement as three of the defining characteristics of people groups that have power and agency in today's world. Yeah. One of the things that we have, should we choose to use it, is a global network. But in order to make use of it, we have to develop a strong identity. And so I leave you with the words of Auntie Affion and Affion in relation to what that should be.
But the other powerful challenge, which needs to manifest is this question of a federation of African states. I mean, one of the reservations that one has is that the states as we have them today on the continent especially are essentially neo-colonial states. And so a federation of neo-colonial states would be one horrible disaster if they're run by neo-colonialists. But then a federation of people to people, and it was something that was discussed, one of the issues we're discussing yesterday, with some of the comrades and colleagues, that were around a table with. This question of people to people solidarity, so that the issue of African federations of us, going into a union, it's not just a government thing. It's not state to state, but it's people to people. And so one of the things that, we must push, all of us, is this fundamental question of the global nature of our African identities. That we stop, to see ourselves as Nigerians and Gabonese and, Ghanaians and Congolese and all these other nonsensical identities that we have. But not just that we talk about them like we're talking now, but that it's actually, embedded in our spirits, in our psyche, and in our approach to our work. Because those of you, who are on the continent know that we face, this crisis of religion, this crisis of ethnicism that is tearing us apart. And the only solution to that is going to, to start to address things and see things as a global body. And that when we speak of a federation of African states, we're not just referring to us on the continent, but that we are coming to the table with all of our power. And our power means the millions of Africans, the diaspora, that there's that clarity of understanding. So it's not something we just talk about or we preach about, but that we actually begin to implement in whatever, ways, we're working, whatever little areas of work, that we engage in.
Kings and queens, the point is made that identity is political. Yes, and Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, is a tool and a framework for the politicization of African identity towards the development of African nationhood and bettering the conditions of African people around the world. There's a lot of distortion around these ideas at the moment, and I hope to have provided some clarity. I've spoken for longer than I intended. So I'm going to conclude here by just thanking Brother Garfield once again for allowing the space and the time. And I look forward to further interactions on subjects such as these. Tendai Mwari, giving thanks unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kozai Muzimu Mukuru, give praises unto our great ancestors, Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodie, African liberation and African power for all African people. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe.
All right, that concludes that. That is 20 for 20. That's your 12th scholar coming out of, I believe he's from the UK. That's Shakara. Y'all got all his contact information. So if y'all have any questions regarding the presentation, he definitely is available. He may slide through the night for our after show, but make sure y'all subscribe to Brother Garfield podcast for those in the chat right now. If you haven't already, hit that like button on your way out and make sure you turn on your notifications because we got another banger coming for you in about 20 minutes. So turn on your notifications, and when we go live again, y'all will be live again with